Hello, and welcome to week 13, where we're going to sum up everything that we've talked about so far in terms of functional assessments. A lot of readings this week. I hope you read them all and read them thoroughly, and we will talk about them in our next class. The first article I want to talk about was the MACE study, which is back in 1994. And MACE suggests that the Awada article, which was originally published in 1982 and then republished again in JABA in 1994, represents the first comprehensive and standardized functional analysis methodology. Now, certainly there were functional analyses prior to 1992. Carr did one in 1977. However, Awada built on some of those early models, and really the contribution that he came up with is giving a structure and a standardized way. There were always sort of generalized discussions around how could you do a functional assessment, an experimental assessment of the events antecedent and consequent. And what Awada and his group contributed, I believe, is they took they actually assigned a methodology. Now, the downside to that is something that people are still saying today, which is when they think of functional analysis, they think of the Awada four conditions. And of course, the take-home point of today's lecture is that a functional analysis is not defined by the Awada four conditions. Clearly, it made a big contribution. Clearly, there are still times when 4 or 5, if you add the tangible in, of the original conditions are necessary. But I think most contemporary functional analyses that you guys would be involved in would be variations of that and not be the Awada four conditions. Although, as many of you have pointed out to me when we've discussed this in class, a lot of people are still saying or thinking, oh, we can't do a functional analysis because that's the Awada four conditions. So Mace also says that when talking about the Awada article and his contributions to functional analysis, that although the original 1982 article focused on just self-injurious behavior, that since then it has been adapted to a wide variety of maladaptive behaviors. And so now we definitely have functional analyses on everything: aggression, pica, disruptive behavior, elopement. When Mace talks about the significance of functional analysis to the field of applied behavior analysis, he's really talking about having a methodology to understand behavior and choose interventions based on the environmental events that affect the behavior has clear benefits over the old style of behavior change, which he refers to as behavior modification, a term that probably you guys have heard of before. And really, what behavior modification connotates generally is the use of arbitrary reinforcers and punishers to reduce maladaptive behavior. So, for example, the old style behavior modification approach might be to just increase the potency of reinforcing an incompatible behavior. Now, that sounds pretty good, and sometimes that's all we can do, but the problem with that kind of approach is that it's not going to be very effective because the arbitrary reinforcer could lose its potency, which means you have to keep adding to it and keep trying to make it more potent to sort of mask the whatever is really reinforcing the behavior. And then sometimes that forces you to use reinforcers that in and of themselves really aren't acceptable. So in the history of ABA, we have made some ethical dilemmas that are still haunting us today of using some arbitrary reinforcers to sort of mask or overcome the natural reinforcers of maladaptive behaviors, such as M&Ms, and people still think there's still people out there that think that that's what we do as applied behavior analysts, is just give M&Ms for behaviors that are incompatible with the maladaptive behaviors. And there's also studies early on in the 60s, 70s of people who used addiction to cigarettes and used cigarettes contingent upon changing behavior. It was very effective, but there's some ethical concerns that are associated with that. Plus, it's not very effective because you have to constantly, at some point, how many cigarettes is going to compensate for not engaging in a maladaptive behavior. You might have to keep increasing that number. Also, on the other side, there were punishers. So you could just punish the behavior. That's sort of the old behavior modification approach. Just keep using more and more intense punishers. Again, obviously, that's not very effective, but even more importantly, it's not ethical at some point that you're going to start to use. And we, unfortunately, will talk about it when we take the ethics class next year. But unfortunately, we have a history of using some pretty unsavory kinds of punishers in order to decrease a maladaptive behavior. So the point is this, that it makes a lot more sense when treatments are matched to the operant function of the aberrant behavior. So what do I mean by that? I mean, when you're doing a functional analysis, you're trying to figure out what exactly is it that is maintaining this behavior. Once you've matched that or identified that, it's a lot easier to do a treatment. Now, basically, once you've identified what is maintaining a maladaptive behavior, instead of just arbitrarily adding reinforcers to try to get it to stop or punish it, you basically do three things, and we'll be talking about these next semester in the intervention class. But basically, you do three things. Once you know that a behavior is maintained by a certain variable, well, you can weaken the maintaining response reinforcer relationship, weaken it through extinction. So, for example, if we know that yelling out is maintained by attention because we did a good functional analysis, then we could just use extinction, which means we'll make sure that we do not provide attention when yelling occurs. Easier said than done, but that would be one way. Two, and these are often done in conjunction with each other, you can strengthen a functional replacement behavior. So you could just teach the person another way to ask for attention. Teach them an appropriate way to say, look at me, or I need to talk to you, or sign that, or hand you a card, and then that would be another way. Now that we know that the behavior is occurring because the individual wants attention, we could provide it with a functional replacement behavior. Functional in that replacement behavior provides exactly the same reinforcer that the maladaptive behavior did. So the person gets the same reinforcer they got for screaming, which is attention. You just have to make sure that that level of attention matches for the appropriate behavior, matches the level of attention that was provided for the maladaptive behavior. And then, of course, just to round it out, you could always use punishment also. Those are the three things we've got when we're changing behavior, is when we're talking about a matched treatment, is extinction, functional replacement behaviors, punishment. So Mace goes on to talk about future directions. Now remember, this article was written in 1994. So what he's saying is, well, at this point, the functional analysis methodology that Awada has given us is very useful and helpful, and we need to use it consistently. But he's also saying that in the future, functional analyses need to be able to identify important variables in the client's own setting. Now remember, back in 1994, when these were being done, they were being done primarily in analog situations. That is, not in the natural environment, in like treatment rooms. And what Mace is saying, and they were long and they were complicated, and they included all four of the Awada conditions repeated over and over again, sometimes for months, literally. And so what Mace is saying is, gee, in the future, we need to be able to identify these variables that are occurring in the person's natural setting. Well, of course, how have we done that? Now we have done that in several examples that we've talked about. We have focused on how now functional analyses have moved into the natural environment, and we'll spend more time talking about that. But one good example of that is Hanley article 2012. I think this is really an important article. I really hope you guys spend some time on this article. It is very important and useful in terms of a direction. It sort of ties together a lot of the recent articles that we read over the last few weeks that were variations of the Awada 4 conditions. But basically what Hanley is talking about is a suggestion of how functional assessment and functional analysis could and should be practiced. What Hanley is suggesting is a general approach to functional assessment, which is starting with an open-ended interview, so an indirect assessment, followed by a brief observation, so a direct or descriptive assessment, just the observation, and then based on what you're getting from that indirect assessment and that direct assessment, then conduct a precise and individualized functional analysis, and a brief one. So the point of that is you're not going to use necessarily all 4 of the Awada conditions. You might not use any of the Awada conditions. For example, if you observed through your indirect and or direct assessments that saying no to an individual was what prompted most of the disruptive behaviors that were your target behavior, then that's all you would run is a condition where two conditions. One, a control condition where you did not say no to her, and another condition where you did say no. And if you're right, it's always going to be high when you say no, or most of the time, and it's almost never going to be high when you don't say no. How many times do you have to do that? 2, 3 sessions? You could do that in an afternoon. You could do that in over a couple of days. And that is essentially what Hanley is talking about. So again, let me repeat that, say it a different way. What Hanley is proposing is indirect and direct assessments to generate hypotheses of what is influencing the problem behavior, and then test them with a functional analysis. The point is that functional analysis is not defined by the Iwata 1982 4 standard conditions. A functional analytic approach should be flexible and it should be individualized. Now, Hanley talks about the same issues that we've been talking about in class. So what are the advantages of this approach, that is a functional analysis? Why not just stop at a descriptive assessment? Well, he gives a rationale for conducting a functional analysis. One is that descriptive assessments, although often useful, may not precisely identify the events, the antecedents and consequences affecting the behavior. So, for example, there may be attention that you do a descriptive assessment, and generally you see that it is around attention, but you don't understand precisely under what conditions that occurs. And an example of that was that Strohmeyer article that we read, where if you recall that it was attention motivated, but it was under very specific conditions. It was under conditions where the attention was just by a preferred staff. He didn't care if he got attention from non-preferred staff, and also under very specific conditions where there was divided attention. That is, that preferred staff took her attention away from him and provided it to someone else. That person that the attention was provided to then became his target. That is hard to figure all out with just a descriptive assessment. But if you recall, over, I think, maybe 5 or 6 sessions in a couple of days, we were able to demonstrate exactly what those precise conditions were. So my point is, again, sometimes, not always, but sometimes a descriptive assessment may not give you the level of detail of what those antecedents, consequences, environmental situations need to be. And sometimes you have to manipulate them systematically. That is a functional analysis in order to understand them. Some of the other reasons, rationale for conducting a functional analysis, we've talked about a lot. One is that descriptive assessments are correlational, so we're stuck with that. We don't know. Attention could be associated with the target behavior, but that doesn't mean it's maintained by it. It could just be because of the nature of the target behavior, elopement, that the person is going to get attention. People are going to try to stop them, that individual, from getting into a dangerous situation and leaving the environment. But that doesn't mean it's maintained by attention. It could be escape. It could be for a tangible. It could be for basically a million other things. Which is related to another rationale for conducting a functional analysis, which is when you're doing a descriptive assessment, relevant variables may be masked. So it might be the case that it looks like that this problem is related to attention because staff are always there, but what we're missing is that it only occurs when there's a particular SD, that is, the availability of an SD that suggests that maybe there's going to be demands that are going to come up, like a book comes out or the math book comes out. And that's when the problem behaviors occur. And we think it's related to attention when it has nothing to do with that. It really has to do with trying to escape or avoid this unpleasant situation, which might be some particular demand. Finally, descriptive assessments may not be precise, and I just went into the details about that. They just may not, they may give you the general idea, but not enough for you to put together a precise, individualized behavior support plan that will effectively address those behavior problems. So, Hanley spends quite a bit of time talking about overcoming some of the obstacles to conducting a functional analysis. And I want to spend a few minutes on these because a lot of these have come up in class that you guys have mentioned. And I hear these all the time. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we'll spend a little bit of time with a few of them. The first one is that it just takes too much time to do a functional analysis. So we don't do functional analyses out here because they take too much time. Well, yes, the Awada original conditions, as I said, I have worked on some of those that literally went months. But they don't have to. As we've pointed out throughout the semester, you could have brief sessions. You could have 5-minute sessions. You don't need to have 15-minute sessions. You can conduct an analysis as Hanley suggests, and some of the studies we read suggest that it is informed by an open-ended interview. And so therefore, you're basing it on indirect and or direct assessments, and now you don't have to run as many conditions because now you're hypothesizing that there's some aspect of this condition and there's some aspect of this, but I don't need to run an attention condition. I don't need to run a tangible condition. I have narrowed it down to this area, so you likely could just run 2 conditions. You can implement those trial-based analyses. Remember, like the Bloom study that we read that was done in a classroom where you just wait until naturally. I've done those in classrooms. I've done those in group home settings when it naturally occurs. If it's a demand kind of condition you want to run, wait until dinner time when there's the demands that are associated with that, or wait until the time the situation in which the target behaviors occur. Finally, we talked about latency-based analyses, which also can affect time and make them shorter, which is instead of counting how many times the target behavior occurs, maybe you would just say what the time was until the first event occurred, then the session's over. When you're doing a latency-based kind of approach, that session could last 10 or 15 seconds and you're done. The second question that came up, or concern or common obstacle to conducting functional analyses, is they're very complex. That video that you guys saw of Awada, he addressed this one also in several of these actually. But again, it doesn't have to be complex. Sometimes it does. This may sound stupid, but a functional analysis only needs to be as complex as it needs to be. So yes, if you have a very complex behavior, you're probably not going to be able to do that in your settings. That person may need to go somewhere where they can have a very complex functional analysis. But in most cases, the vast majority of cases, I think that using descriptive, indirect, and direct assessments in order to come up with a condition where you can just have to use a single test condition and match it with a single control condition, that functional analysis will not necessarily be that complex. All right, another issue that or common obstacle that people talk about is trying to sell a functional analysis. And I know, several of you have said, oh, in my settings, we don't do them. People say we don't do them. And of course, they're focusing on the Iwata conditions. But I think when you're talking to families and you're talking to teachers and you're talking to people, one, of course, is, as Hanley says, building a therapeutic relationship by doing open-ended kind of interviewing with these folks is really going to be helpful. And describing the practical and humane reasons for understanding function prior to treating the problem behavior. It's common sense, and I have found that families get this when you explain it this way. If your car was having problems and you said you brought it into a mechanic and you said, when I go over 60, it makes this noise. And well, would you want the person to start treating or start ripping things out of your car and putting new things in based on that? I certainly wouldn't. I would want them to get in my car and drive it over 60 and hear the noise. Now, that's not good. The more that noise is going on, it probably means that there's something that's bad, and, that's not a good thing. But I want that person to see it also because they're the expert and they can fix it. It's really the same thing with us. Now, of course, safety is most important, but for the most part, and most of the target behaviors we're dealing with, if the person is engaging in the target behavior 10 or 15 times a day, like screaming, trying to elope, aggression, they're doing it anyway. So for us to try to put some conditions in place where we think it's going to occur, like driving the car over 60 miles an hour, a few times really makes sense. And I think, in my experience, people get that. Parents get that. Family members get that. Teachers get that. That we have to see it, and we need to demonstrate to ourselves that this is really occurring under those conditions. So a couple of other things that Hanley talks about is using analogies to explain the logic and the conditions, and adopting the tactics for decreasing the assessment length and for increasing safety of the analysis. Right, explaining how you are going to ensure that the person is safe. And you really need to do that. We'll talk about that some more when we talk about the NIDER study. But of course, having a plan for maintaining safety is absolutely critical. All right, another obstacle that often comes up to conducting functional analyses is related, and that's the danger to the person. Again, Iwata addressed this one also, but one is conducting the analysis in an environment that allows for the problem behavior to occur safely. So, you know, if you're in an area where the person can't hurt themselves, I did a study on a person who had pica that was very severe. They had to have several surgeries to remove items from their stomach. And of course, the parents were not were very keen on not having that person engage in the behavior. But I had to see it. I needed to do an analysis to understand the behavior. So we used latency. And we blocked it. We used a blocking condition. So what we measured was how quickly she tried to put certain things in her mouth under certain conditions. And then someone was right in the room and they blocked it right away. Using signaled contingencies and continuous schedules of programmed consequences. Okay, so this is one that is so common. I have some videos. I'll bring them in for you to see. That when you run these, and there are what we mean by signaled contingencies and continuous schedules. For example, attention motivated. Of a young man who's really not hitting himself in the face, but he's taking his hand and he's sort of waving it in front of his face like, I'm about to do this, I'm about to do this. Well, of course, then the contingencies go into effect. So he doesn't really even hurting himself. Additionally, with self-injurious behavior that is maintained by negative reinforcement, escaping or avoiding something unpleasant, is all we have to do is if for example, the SD is academic tasks, is just show them the academic tasks and they start to lift their hand like they're going to hit themselves, say, okay, we're going to stop. Generally, individuals don't continue to hit themselves. So, by signaling those consequences and making it very clear, it escalates because people aren't clear. They try to ignore it at first, and so it has to escalate to a higher level. But also, implementing the latency-based analyses, that will help to protect someone also, as we've talked about, and Hanley talks about several other ones. Couple of these other things, covert behaviors, assaulting the environment or baiting the environment. That is, with this pica girl I was talking, a girl who engaged in pica. She had a specific kind of pica she engaged in, and those items that she would consume, we put into a room. She would only do it when people weren't looking, but as we mentioned, we had to stop her from actually ingesting them. So we had all these intricate little conditions where we pretended that there was someone sitting in the room, but they weren't looking at her. They were pretending they were like napping or working on a computer thing, and she would look at them and see they're not even looking in her direction. But then as soon as she would pick up the item, we would signal we were watching through a one-way mirror and knock on the window or indicate through a bug in the ear to the staff, and they could catch her before she actually engaged in the behavior. Point is, there are ways of dealing with low rate and covert problem behaviors if you really want to try to do it. Finally, some of the other obstacles are when you have multiple functions of the behavior. Well, you can do one function at a time. And under those conditions, when the reinforcers for the behavior are continuously changing, now we're getting into some really complex kind of behaviors. And maybe you can't do those in your environments, but one way is to constantly reassess what the reinforcers are immediately prior to each condition. So Hanley also talks about when to consider a functional analysis. And let me be clear here. All problem behavior does not require a functional does not require a functional analysis. This says assessment, and that should say analysis. Yeah, big mistake. All right, change that. So let me be clear here. All problem behavior does not require a functional analysis prior to developing a treatment. All problem behavior does require a functional assessment. So you have to do some kind of functional assessment, but not necessarily a functional analysis prior to developing a treatment plan. So are we clear? Let me say that again. All problem behavior does not require a functional analysis, but it does require a functional assessment prior to developing a treatment. All right, and finally, sometimes teaching appropriate replacement behaviors may be all you need to do to address the problem. So, that's going back to this first point, that all problem behavior does not require a functional analysis. Sometimes just teaching appropriate replacement behaviors may be all you need to do to address the problem. That was Stedman who was commenting on what I was saying. So finally, Hanley talks about who should do a functional analysis. And this is a controversy that's been going on for a long time. Should teachers do it if they have training? Well, I think Hanley says the same thing, that they really shouldn't. This takes some skills to do. And certainly teachers could conduct the sessions under the supervision of a BCBA. So for example, if you were doing some trial-based functional analysis, you could do that with the teacher, and they would be conducting it, but under your supervision. But I definitely think that only BCBAs should be doing functional analyses. So in conclusion, Hanley's conclusions are: a functional analysis is not defined by the Iwata 1982 4 standard conditions. It should be flexible. It should be individualized. And he goes on to say that indirect and direct assessments should be used to generate hypotheses of what is influencing problem behavior and then test them. All right, let's move on to the Neidert study chapter. And this really is an excellent overview of functional analysis. I'm just going to talk about some of the highlights right here. So, just summarizing everything we've talked about functional analysis is, functional analyses involve the direct observation and measurement of problem behavior during systematic manipulation of environmental events. So let me say that again. That is a definition of functional analysis. They involve direct observation, yes, and systematic manipulation. So you are observing and you're manipulating the environment, both antecedents and consequences, to see what's going on. The assumptions of a functional analysis are that there is no correlation between problem behaviors or populations and effective treatments. So the assumption of why you do a functional analysis is that we don't have effective treatments based on the problem behavior. So in other words, there is no effective treatment for aggression or SIB or disruption or elopement. It depends on the individual. And there is no treatment for everything that an autistic person does. There's no treatment based on a population or a problem behavior. It has to be individualized. Another assumption is problem behavior is learned, and these learning processes include certain maintaining variables. One is some kind of positive reinforcement, gaining attention, access to attention or preferred items. Some kind of potentially negative reinforcement, that is, avoiding or escaping aversive situations, and automatic conditions, which are non-social variables such as sensory stimulation, but could really mean anything. So the assumption is that all behaviors are going to be based on one of those. Now you think that's pretty easy. The problem is attention and attention aren't the same. And in many cases, and we've talked about several of these examples, it's going to be very specific kinds of these under very specific environmental conditions. That is what you have to identify in order to have a effective treatment that's going to match your assessment. You have to be able to figure out, and we'll spend a lot of time next semester talking about, attention motivated behaviors, but you'll see they're very, very different under the conditions under which they occur, and therefore the interventions are very, very different. So even though there's only a few things, gaining something you want or getting away from something you don't want, those are the basics. But within those, there's an infinite number of situations that if you're going to have the most effective kind of treatment, you're going to have to be able to identify. So contingencies, another assumption of functional analysis is contingencies of reinforcement consist of reinforcing consequences that maintain problem behavior, discriminative stimuli that signal the availability of reinforcement, and establishing operations that establish the value of the reinforcing consequences. So these contingencies of reinforcement, this is very important. These contingencies of reinforcement we need to understand in order to come up with a treatment, the most effective kind of treatment. So for example, an attention motivated problem behavior. So let's say that in a classroom situation, we have a kid who engages in disruptive behavior. And so the target behavior is disruptive behavior. The reinforcing consequences are attention. The discriminative stimuli, all right, so now we know what's maintaining it. That's good. But we still need to know what are the SDs, the discriminative stimuli that signal the availability of reinforcement. Well, let's say it is a particular kid who sits next to him who, when he becomes disruptive, really pays attention to him and laughs and thinks he's the funniest guy in the world, which makes him laugh a lot. And that there is the SD would be that when the teacher says, oh, we're going to do reading right now, and so I want you to turn to the student next to you and I want you to read a passage to the student next to you, and have the student next to you read a passage back to you. That's the SD, which prompts him that now he has an opportunity to be disruptive and have his best friend start laughing at him. And then you want to look at the establishing operations, and just think about those that establish the value of the reinforcing consequence. So we're talking about establishing operations or motivating operations, that those are things that affect the value of the reinforcer. So if this kid is attention motivated, if he gets attention from his buddy, that is exactly the kind of attention that he absolutely loves. So that's the establishing operation. It is increasing the value of the reinforcer for the maladaptive behavior, because now you've put him in touch. That's the SD. You've put him in touch with the most intense kind of attention that he can get. So you need to understand, if we're going to be most effective with a treatment, we need to understand all those components. What's reinforcing it? Attention. What's the SD? Well, asking him to interact with an individual who attends to him. And that the establishing operation is, this is a kid who really reinforces his behavior and responds in a way that really makes the attention much more valuable to him, because of the way that his friend or this particular kid responds by, let's say, laughing at him or something else. So hopefully you've got that, because that's an important part of what we are trying to do with assessments, and then the treatment sort of falls off of that. Let's talk about this next time in class. If you have questions, write them down, go back, look them up, or email me, ask me questions in class, next class we have. But let's make sure you understand that point. So finally, another assumption is that functional analyses are designed to experimentally identify antecedent and consequent conditions. So that's basically saying in another way what we're saying here, that we want to understand the antecedent conditions. That could be the SD, that is, what is the environmental event. So if we look at it, let me give you another example. If we look at it from the other side of negative reinforcement, the SD might be bringing out the book of math problems. So that's the discriminative stimuli. The reinforcing consequence is, if the student becomes self-injurious, that the teacher doesn't ask him to do the math problems, or at the very least delays implementing them, which they probably would, because they would be now trying to stop him from hurting himself. And the establishing operation is that he hates math problems, and these are the math problems that he hates the most. So that's making this reinforcer even stronger. All right. So Neidert also talks about preparing for a functional analysis. So, the most obvious, and I think this is, that's why I like this chapter, does a nice job of very practical things, is the target behavior a problem? And we've talked in class about, it might have been last semester, but target behaviors, and that sometimes target behavior isn't a problem, like the example I gave of the brain injured kid who the speech pathologist reinforced him grabbing people as a way to communicate, and other people were interpreting that as aggression. Well, now that once you understand that, now you understand it, then in fact you realize, well, that target behavior isn't really a problem. It's a communication, and the team just needs to decide, do they want to teach them another way to communicate? And then you need to do a risk assessment. Safety is going to be very important when you're doing these functional analyses. And so for example, when I used to do functional analyses with people who had very severe self-injurious behavior, always had a medical professional, a doctor usually, who would give us specific details after seeing the person of exactly what we could do and couldn't do, and when exactly the session had to be terminated due to safety reasons, to obviously maximize the person being able to stay safe. And as we've said before, you could use latency measures also as another way to address some of those risk factors. And then finally, information gathering, and this is consistent with what we've been saying about these variations in a functional assessment, and certainly consistent with the Hanley article, is that indirect and direct assessments are used to inform the functional analysis. So you always need to do an indirect and direct descriptive kind of assessment. Sometimes that may be enough, but otherwise you're going to use those to inform you, that inform the functional analysis. That is, so you can only have to do one condition. So, you do an indirect and a direct assessment. You think you identified that saying no is a salient environmental event. Well, you could then do a really easy functional analysis of just saying no, and then maybe there's different aspects of saying no, and who says no, and how they say no, and variations of no. Well, it would be pretty easy to just alternate those conditions back and forth with a control, and you could do a quick and easy functional analysis that is based on an indirect and a direct assessment. In terms of implementing a functional analysis, well, first you have to identify what your conditions are. That's what we've been talking about. What are they going to be? Are you going to run all four AWADA conditions, or are you going to use the indirect and the direct assessments to inform your functional analysis, and maybe you'll just use one condition and a control? And then how are you going to present those conditions? How long are the sessions going to be? What's your experimental design going to be? So, in summary, again, I think this NIDR chapter is an excellent one, and I hope you read it and spend some time with it and try to understand everything that is in it, because it's going to be helpful for you. There's also the appendix at the end, which I think is very cool, which just sort of summarizes and runs through. That's on page 162, which I recommend that you look at and read also, which summarizes all of the things we just talked about. Again, questions? Well, let's talk about them in our next face-to-face class. All right, so let me try to summarize. I know this was long and a lot, but let me try to summarize this. So let's talk about the definition. Functional analysis is a form of a functional assessment, right? That involves... So it is part of a functional assessment that involves both direct observation and systematic manipulation of antecedent and consequent events. In other words, it's an experimental functional assessment. It's an experiment. It's been demonstrated as an effective assessment procedure for identifying the specific environmental events associated with various target behaviors. So there's now 50 years of research that have demonstrated that, variations of functional assessments can be very, very effective in identifying specific environmental events associated with various kinds of target behaviors. Now, early on, the early functional analysis literature had been conducted in highly controlled, analog, inpatient, sort of the early Awada stuff, settings, typically involving many sessions over extended periods of time. But subsequently, many people have argued that functional assessment is effective, however, too complex, too time-consuming, and cumbersome for most practitioners. But now we know we have variations in functional assessment, and there are things that I think you guys could do in your settings that can be incredibly powerful in terms of helping you understand the functions. What are the antecedents? What are the consequences to problem behavior? And hopefully you're getting that. Understanding those antecedents and those consequences is critical to a function-based treatment. It's critical to the most effective kinds of treatments. I'm not saying you can't treat them, and sometimes we have to because we can't figure out what exactly is maintaining a behavior by just throwing in reinforcers and trying to find other reinforcers to reinforce incompatible behavior and throwing in some punishers. I'm not saying that can't be effective. It's just not nearly as efficient, and it's quite frankly more dangerous as far as I'm concerned, because it's easy to fall in the trap of just, coming up with more and more powerful reinforcers that, because they're so powerful, they may in fact be unhealthy or otherwise not beneficial to the individual. And of course, it's obvious the trouble you could get yourself in if you start trying to use more and more powerful punishers. Pretty soon you could find yourself crossing a line and engaging in unethical behaviors. So some of the things we've talked about this semester, and this is by no means complete, these are just the studies that we looked at this semester, are in terms of variations in functional analysis. And I mean variations from the Awada 4 or 5 conditions procedure. And one is, of course, doing things in naturalistic, not in an analog situation in a room, but naturalistically. We talked about several studies that were done in classrooms or in individuals' homes. We talked about functional analyses can be brief. Northrop was the first one to talk about that. Several studies that we've talked about have emphasized the use of brief functional assessments. Now, sometimes they're not as good. Remember this study, Koenig and Awada, did not indicated that about a third of the brief functional analyses did not give a correct response, but that's pretty good. That means that 2/3 of the time it is going to be as effective as a longer one. We also talked about investigation of fewer variables, using that philosophy of using direct and indirect assessments to inform your functional analysis. In other words, using direct and indirect functional assessments to come up with the one or two at the most salient variables, and then manipulating those quickly using a brief functional analysis. We talked about trial-based, where you can incorporate them into the individual's daily schedule, so you don't even have to change their daily schedule. Just tell the staff, hey, when you place a demand on him, if he engages in this behavior, do this. If he engages in that behavior, do that. And then finally, the manipulation of the target behaviors. That is, again, when you're dealing with a behavior that may be unsafe, is a lot of times there's a precursor to that target behavior. I think we talked about this study talked about an example of a fellow who engaged in property destruction that was very, very severe. But prior to that, he always started swearing. So we targeted swearing, never let it get to property destruction. And so we were able to do a functional analysis without the danger of the property destruction, with just dealing with the swearing. So here's your assignment for this week, which is due in our next face-to-face class period. So I want you to tell me what is the potential usefulness of functional analysis in your clinical site. Now, I get it that some of the folks you work with say, "Oh, we don't do that." But if you were in charge, how would you see that you could, if you think you can? How would you do it? What variations would you include? Include the advantages and disadvantages of doing functional analyses. And of course, I want you to use these studies and cite these studies to support whatever it is you're saying. And what specifically could a functional analysis look like in your site? Again, cite some studies that talk about the way you might do it. Maximum two double-spaced pages, and again, due next week. So basically what I want is, how could you, if you own the world, could you do functional analysis? What would it look like? And then tell me sort of what it would be based on, and cite enough of these articles so that you've convinced me that you've read them and you understand them. And any questions that you guys have on this, ask me, write them down. Hopefully you were writing them down as we go through this. Write them down and either ask me in next face-to-face class, or email them to me, or we'll figure out a way to get to them. But if there's anything I'm saying, anything that's in these articles that's not clear to you, let's deal with it. All right. Very good. Have a good week, and I will see you guys next week. Take care.